Hello everyone. Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. I know a lot of you like to listen to these videos before falling asleep, and I'm here to help. Before you drift off, please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. The first snowfall of the season always brought a sense of wonder. The town of Evergreen, nestled deep in the mountains, felt like a postcard every December. This year, however, the snow arrived early and heavier than usual, blanketing the town in a silence that felt heavier than normal. Lila, a 26-year-old art teacher, had recently moved to Evergreen, craving the quiet she thought would help her creativity. She rented an old, creaky cabin just outside the town, surrounded by towering pines. Everyone warned her about the isolation, but she welcomed it. Or so she thought. The first night in the cabin was peaceful. She drank hot cocoa by the fireplace, watching snowflakes fall like tiny diamonds. It was quiet. Too quiet. But that was what she wanted, wasn't it? A break from the chaos of the city. That night, however, she awoke with a start. At first, she couldn't understand what had pulled her from her sleep. The cabin was dark, the only sound the faint howling of the wind outside. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, almost like someone calling her name. Lila. Her heart skipped a beat. It was soft, almost like a breeze moving through the room, but unmistakable. She sat up in bed, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The whisper came again, this time closer, louder. "Lila." She turned on her bedside lamp, the yellow light casting long shadows on the wooden walls. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Her stomach churned as the whispering stopped. She convinced herself it was her mind playing tricks, the isolation messing with her senses. By morning, the world outside looked serene. The snow sparkled under the weak sunlight, and the cabin seemed less menacing in the daylight. She chalked up the night's events to nerves and pushed the thought away. But the whispers didn't stop. Each night they grew louder, more persistent. Sometimes they came from the walls, other times from outside her window, though the snow was untouched each morning. Lila, they called, soft and chilling. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. Perhaps the old cabin was just settling in the cold, or maybe the wind carried sounds in strange ways. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. On the fifth night, the whisper wasn't alone. As she lay in bed, wide awake, she heard something scratching at her bedroom window. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more frantic. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head to the window. There was a shadow. It was tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally as if listening for something. The scratching continued, now paired with a low, raspy breathing. Lila couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed with fear, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it an animal? A person? But the shadow's shape was wrong, its limbs too long, its movements too jerky. Gathering her courage, she reached for the lamp beside her bed. The light flooded the room, but when she looked back at the window, the shadow was gone. The next morning, she decided to investigate. Bundling up in her thickest coat, she stepped outside, her boots crunching in the snow. She circled the cabin, her breath visible in the icy air. When she reached her bedroom window, her stomach dropped. There were footprints in the snow. They were human-like but larger, with long, clawed toes that dug deep into the ground. The tracks circled her cabin, leading off into the woods. Lila's hands shook as she followed them, her heart pounding. The tracks led to a clearing. In the center stood an old well, its stones covered in frost. The tracks ended there, as if whatever had made them had climbed into the well or out of it. A sudden gust of wind sent snow swirling around her, and she heard it again. Lila. This time it was louder, echoing from the well. She backed away, her instincts screaming at her to run. But as she turned, she saw them, shapes moving through the trees. They were tall and thin, their limbs contorted in ways that defied logic. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, filling her ears. "Lila, come to us." She ran. Her boots slipped on the snow as she bolted back to the cabin, the whispers chasing her. She slammed the door shut, locking it and pushing a chair under the handle for good measure. The night that followed was the longest of her life. The whispers surrounded the cabin, growing louder and more desperate. Shadows moved outside her windows, their forms barely visible against the snow. And then, just before dawn, it stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Lila stayed awake, clutching a kitchen knife, until the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. She left the cabin that day, leaving most of her belongings behind. The townspeople didn't seem surprised when she told them what had happened. They simply exchanged uneasy glances and warned her never to go near the well again. Lila never returned to Evergreen, but on cold, quiet nights, she still hears the whispers in her dreams. Lila thought leaving Evergreen would be the end of her nightmare, but it seemed the shadows of that winter night had followed her. She moved back to the city, renting a small apartment surrounded by bustling streets and constant noise. She thought the endless hum of urban life would drown out the memories of that dreadful cabin and the voices that haunted her. For a while it worked. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers faded into the background of her mind, reduced to fleeting thoughts she dismissed as overactive imagination. But deep down, she felt an uneasiness that clung to her like a second shadow. Then, on the first snowfall of the season, it began again. She was walking home from work, the city sidewalks blanketed in fresh snow, when she felt it, a chill that wasn't from the cold. It crept up her spine, making her pause. The bustling street seemed quieter, the voices of passers-by fading into a muffled haze. She turned her head, scanning the street behind her, but nothing seemed out of place. And then she heard it. Lila. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was faint, almost swallowed by the city's noise, but it was there. The same whisper she had thought she left behind. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "It's just in my head, it's not real." She quickened her pace, the heels of her boots clicking sharply against the icy pavement. The city lights shimmered in the snow, casting long shadows on the ground. But as she walked, she noticed something strange. The shadows were moving. Not the normal, flickering movement of pedestrians or cars, but something unnatural. They darted and twisted, too fast to be human. Her heart pounded as she tried to ignore them, focusing on the street ahead. When she reached her apartment, she slammed the door shut and locked it, her chest heaving with panic. "It's just stress," she told herself. "I'm tired, that's all." But that night, the whispers returned. "Lila, you can't run." She woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat despite the cold. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside her window. She stayed in bed, listening, her ears straining for any sound. And then she heard it, a soft scraping, like nails against glass. Her blood turned to ice as her eyes darted to the window. For a moment she saw nothing, but then a face appeared. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. It pressed its face against the glass, fogging it with its breath. "Lila." She screamed, scrambling out of bed and grabbing the nearest object, a heavy lamp. She hurled it at the window, shattering the glass. When she looked again, the face was gone, but the whispers remained, filling the room like a suffocating fog. The days that followed were a blur. Lila barely slept, barely ate, her mind consumed by the voices and the shadows that seemed to follow her everywhere. She started noticing them in the reflections of shop windows, in the dark corners of alleys, always watching, always waiting. Desperate, she began researching the history of Evergreen and the well she had found in the woods. What she uncovered only deepened her terror. The well had been the site of countless disappearances dating back centuries. Local legends spoke of a creature, an ancient, malevolent spirit that lived beneath the earth, feeding on the souls of those it lured into its lair. The spirit was said to mark its victims, following them until they either succumbed to its whispers or went mad. Lila's hands shook as she read the accounts, the words blurring through her tears. Was that what was happening to her? Was she marked? The answer came that night. She was sitting in her living room, surrounded by every light she owned, clutching a mug of tea with trembling trays. The whispers had been growing louder, more insistent, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices. And then, suddenly they stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. She sat frozen, her breath shallow, waiting for what would come next. The lights flickered. Her mug shattered on the floor as the bulbs above her head blew out one by one, plunging the room into darkness. And then she saw it. The figure from her window stood in the corner of the room, its long limbs stretching unnaturally toward the ceiling. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers as it began to move, its body jerking and twisting like a marionette. "Lila." It spoke this time, its voice a guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. She backed away, her legs shaking, until she hit the wall. "Why me?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The creature tilted its head, its grin widening. "Because you listened." The room seemed to warp around her, the walls closing in as the whispers returned, louder than ever. They were inside her head now, drowning out her thoughts, her screams, everything. And then there was nothing. The next morning, Lila's apartment was empty. The police found no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The only clue was the shattered window in her bedroom and the faint outline of clawed footprints in the snow outside. Her disappearance became just another unsolved case, a mystery that would fade with time. But those who knew the legend of the well understood the truth. The whispers had claimed another soul. Story 2. It was Christmas Eve, and Emma sat by the window, staring at the snow as it fell softly onto the ground. She had always loved this time of year when the world seemed to slow down, the air crisp with winter's bite, and the streets filled with festive cheer. But this year felt different. The usual warmth of the season had been replaced with a chilling unease that she couldn't shake. She had recently moved into an old, isolated house on the outskirts of town. The house, while charming with its vintage details and cozy rooms, always gave off a strange vibe. The creaking floorboards, the whispering wind through the cracks in the walls, there was something about it that made Emma feel like she was never truly alone, even when no one else was there. As the snowflakes danced in the wind, Emma tried to brush away the feeling. "It's just the house settling," she whispered to herself, trying to comfort her racing thoughts. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just the house. The first time she'd heard it, she had convinced herself it was just the wind, the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping, as if something was knocking on the walls from the inside. But each night the tapping grew louder. It wasn't a random noise. It was deliberate, a pattern, a message. Emma had tried to ignore it, but tonight, the night before Christmas, she couldn't anymore. It was as if something was trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. She stood up, pacing the room nervously. The clock struck midnight, and with it came a chilling silence. The wind outside had stopped, and the house seemed unnaturally still. Her breath caught in her throat as the tapping began again. But this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the attic. Her heart began to race. The attic. She had never gone up there. It was locked, the door sealed tight with an old brass key that she had found hidden in a drawer when she first moved in. She hadn't thought much of it, just assumed it was locked for a reason. But now, the sound was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was in the attic. Against her better judgment, Emma grabbed the key from the drawer. Her hands shook as she held it in front of her, staring at the cold metal that seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. She walked slowly toward the attic door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The moment she inserted the key into the lock, she felt a cold gust of air brush against her face, as if the attic itself was breathing. The door creaked open with an eerie sound that made Emma's skin crawl. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with thoughts of what she might find. But her curiosity got the best of her, and she stepped into the darkened attic. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. Emma could barely make out the shape of old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked in haphazard piles, and forgotten relics from the past. But what caught her attention was a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. It was old, its wood darkened with age, and it seemed to beckon her closer. The tapping had stopped, but she could feel a strange energy pulsing from it, as if it were alive. Her hand trembled as she reached for the chest. The moment her fingers brushed against the cold surface, the attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Emma spun around, panic rising in her chest. The room was now completely dark, the only light coming from the faint moonbeam that filtered through a crack in the roof. She reached for her phone, but the screen remained blank. No signal. A low, guttural growl echoed through the attic. Emma's heart stopped. The sound seemed to come from the chest, vibrating through the air like a warning. She backed away slowly, but her feet tangled in something, sending her crashing to the floor. As she scrambled to get up, her eyes fell upon a shadow, a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Its eyes glowed in the dark, bright and unblinking, staring straight at her. Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward her, its steps slow and deliberate. Emma felt the blood drain from her face as it drew closer, its long fingers reaching out toward her. And then, in an instant, it was gone. The attic door flew open again, and Emma bolted out of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop running until she was back in her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The whispers and tapping had returned, but now they were louder, more urgent, as if the house itself was trying to tell her something. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, counting down the seconds until Christmas morning. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her, something that had been trapped in the attic for far too long. The night stretched on, and the shadows grew deeper. The whispers never stopped. When the morning light finally broke through the dark, Emma packed her things and fled. She never returned to the house. But no matter where she went, the whispers followed. As the light of Christmas morning filtered through the windows, Emma sat on the edge of her bed, still trembling. She had tried to gather her thoughts, but the events of the night were too much. What had happened in the attic? What was that thing she had seen? And the whispers, why did they follow her even after she left the house? She couldn't stop thinking about the chest in the attic. She had never opened it. The growl, the shadowy figure, the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. It was as if whatever had been trapped in that chest had finally been released. With a shaking hand, she reached for her phone, hoping to get some kind of clarity, some comfort. She needed to talk to someone. Anyone. But when she unlocked it, she found a single new notification, an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was simple: "You should have never come back." Her heart raced as she clicked open the email. The text inside was short, but chilling. "I see you remember. You always will. The house never forgets." Emma's mind spun. Who could have sent this? How did they know about the events in the attic? It had to be a prank, right? But something deep inside her told her it wasn't. This wasn't something to be ignored. The whispers weren't done with her yet. Her phone buzzed again. Another email. She hesitated but opened it. This time the message was longer. "You opened the chest, didn't you? Now it wants you. It remembers you." The air in her room seemed to grow colder, and Emma wrapped her arms around herself, trying to fend off the chill that had spread throughout her body. She tried to convince herself that it was just the draft from the open window, but she knew better. The words from the email were true. She had opened the chest, and now there was no going back. The entity that had been released was connected to her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. A knock on the door broke her from her thoughts. She froze, eyes wide. Who could it be? No one should be here, not today. Not after everything she had just been through. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice soft and melodic, yet eerily unnatural. Emma, let me in." Her heart pounded in her chest. That voice had sounded almost familiar, but not quite. It was distant, distorted, like something from a dream or a nightmare. Slowly, she crept toward the door, her breath shallow as she peeked through the small crack in the doorframe. Nothing. Her pulse raced. She could feel it, the presence on the other side of the door. The whispers were growing louder now, frantic. Emma's hands shook as she fumbled for the lock, desperately trying to keep the door shut. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew faster, harder, as if whatever was outside was becoming more impatient with her hesitation. Let me in, Emma," the voice continued. It was no longer soft, no longer melodic. It was raw, desperate. And then there was the sound of something scraping against the wood. Long, jagged claws dragging across the surface, making Emma's skin crawl. She backed away from the door, eyes wide with terror. She couldn't breathe. She needed to escape, but she couldn't leave. There was nowhere left to go. The house was alive. As if sensing her panic, the room grew darker. The shadows seemed to stretch and crawl, inching closer to her. And then, from the corner of the room, something emerged. Slowly, deliberately. It was the figure from the attic, the one with the glowing eyes. But now, it was different. It had no shape, no form, just a dark mass of tendrils that moved and twisted like smoke. Emma turned to flee, but the door she had locked burst open with a force so powerful, it cracked the frame. And there, Standing in the doorway was the thing. It was no longer a mere shadow. It was real, tangible, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to bore into her very soul. Its skin, if it could even be called, that was the color of rot, stretched thin over its skeletal frame. Its fingers were long and sharp, twitching with hunger. "Let me in, Emma," it whispered. Its voice was cold, like the winter wind, and it sounded as though it was speaking from the deepest pits of hell. The creature lunged and Emma screamed, backing away in fear. But there was nowhere to run. It was closing in, its bony fingers reaching for her. And then, everything stopped. The creature froze in place, its hand inches from her face. Emma stared at it in disbelief. What was happening? Was this the end? But the whispers in her head grew louder now, louder than ever. And suddenly she understood. It wasn't the house that was alive, it was something inside her. Something that had followed her here. Something that had been bound to her the moment she had entered the house. And now it wanted her. Her breathing quickened, and she found herself whispering, as if reciting a prayer, "It's not over. It's not over. I can't let it be over." The creature snarled, its face twisting in rage. "You are mine, Emma, forever." But Emma, with every ounce of strength she could muster, screamed, "No." And the house listened. The room felt as though it were closing in on her. Emma's heart pounded in her chest and she could hardly breathe, the weight of the cold air pressing against her like a suffocating blanket. That voice, that eerie voice, the one that had been calling her from the attic, was still echoing in her head. It was impossible to escape. The very walls of the house seemed to conspire against her, twisting, groaning, and shifting like they were alive. She stood in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do next. Should she leave? Should she go back to the attic? She didn't even know what she was running from anymore. The phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out. It was another message from the same mysterious sender. "You never should have opened the door. Now you're here, trapped. Forever." The words sent a chill down her spine. How could they know what happened? How could they know about the door in the attic? It was impossible. She had never told anyone about it. She hadn't even told her family about the strange things she had felt when she was growing up in that house. Emma walked towards the window, trying to steady her breath. She could see the snow falling heavily outside, but the beauty of the snowfall only made her feel more isolated. The world beyond the walls of the house felt far away, unreachable. There was another noise. This time it wasn't the wind or the creaking of the house, it was something heavier, more deliberate. A sound coming from upstairs. Emma froze, her blood running cold. She knew what it was, the footsteps. They were growing closer. Whoever or whatever was in her house was coming for her. She had no doubt in her mind that it was the same entity that had haunted the attic, the one she had tried to run from. With each step it took, she could feel her grip on reality slipping. She was starting to lose control. Was she dreaming? Was she imagining all of this? But the footsteps grew louder, closer now. The door to her bedroom slowly creaked open. Emma's breath hitched. She didn't dare turn around, afraid of what she might see, but she couldn't resist. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head. At first, there was nothing, just darkness. But then, a shape emerged. A figure, its outline distorted by the shadows. Emma's blood ran cold when she saw it. The figure from the attic, the one with glowing, hollow eyes, was standing there, watching her. She gasped, stumbling back, her legs unsteady beneath her. It moved toward her with unnatural grace, its long, thin fingers reaching out like a predator, its eyes fixated on her with an intensity that made her heart race. No matter how hard she tried to move, her body refused to cooperate. The room spun. It felt as though the air had thickened, suffocating her, pressing her into the floor. "Emma," the voice was a hiss, dripping with malice. "I've been waiting for you." She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. All she could do was stare as the thing came closer, its breath cold against her skin. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't move. It was as though she were paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape from. The thing stopped right in front of her. Its face, if it could even be called, that was nothing but a dark, hollow void. Its features were too distorted to make sense of, but Emma could feel its presence, like it was crawling beneath her skin. "You should have left," it whispered. "You should have never come back." A cold, sharp pain pierced her chest. and she gasped, her vision going blurry. The room spun, the world around her distorting in unnatural ways. The thing's grip tightened around her, pulling her closer, as if it was drawing the very life out of her. And then there was nothing. Emma felt the icy grip of the entity tighten around her, but she couldn't move. It was as though the weight of the world had settled on her chest, making each breath harder to take. The thing in front of her loomed, its presence so heavy that the air itself seemed to grow thick, suffocating her. The dark, hollow figure slowly leaned closer, its breath icy against her skin. Its voice low and distorted whispered again, "You should have never come back. This is where you belong now." Her heart pounded, her chest constricting in fear. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but her voice was caught in her throat. The words she tried to form seemed to get swallowed by the darkness surrounding her. The figure's eyes, glowing and hollow, gazed deeply into hers, as if it were reading her very soul. The longer it stared, the more Emma felt like she was sinking into its darkness, losing her identity, her sense of self. It was as if she were being consumed, swallowed whole by its malevolent energy. She managed to lift one trembling hand to her chest, trying to push away the cold, but it felt useless. The more she resisted, the stronger its hold became, as though her struggles were feeding it, making it more powerful. Tears welled up in her eyes as the pain in her chest grew. What was this thing? How had it gotten here? How had it known her name, known about the door in the attic? As if reading her mind, the figure spoke again, its voice mocking her confusion. "You're not the first to come here. This house has a history, Emma. A history that ties you to it. You've always been a part of it, even if you don't remember." Emma's head spun. The words felt like a punch to her gut. Her memory was cloudy, as if something was trying to block out the truth. She tried to fight it, tried to hold on to whatever she could remember. But the more she struggled, the more the figure's presence consumed her thoughts, drowning her in an overwhelming sense of helplessness. "Who are you?" she finally managed to choke out, her voice a whisper, barely audible. The thing tilted its head, as if amused by her question. It took a step back, allowing Emma to catch her breath, though the air still felt thick and oppressive. "I am the keeper of this house. And so are you." The words echoed in her mind. "The keeper?" "Yes," it whispered, its voice like ice scraping against glass. "You belong to this house. You always have. You just forgot." The sense of dread washed over her as memories began to resurface, faint flashes of her childhood in this very house, long-forgotten images of the attic, the door, and a strange feeling of being watched. But they were all jumbled, distorted, like they had been buried deep inside her mind. Emma's heart raced as realization hit her. The door in the attic, the strange occurrences, the nightmares, it was all connected. The house hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting for her. The figure's hollow eyes bored into hers, and for a moment, Emma felt like she was drowning in its gaze. It was pulling her deeper, dragging her back into the past that she had tried so hard to forget, the past that had been waiting for her return. "You are the next keeper," the entity said, its voice cold and final. "The house calls to you. It has always called to you." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Emma wanted to deny it, to run, to escape this nightmare. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had never truly left this house. It had always been a part of her. The fear she had felt in her childhood, the strange pull she had always felt towards the attic, it had all been a warning. "You cannot leave," the figure whispered, stepping even closer, its cold fingers brushing her cheek. "You were never meant to leave." Suddenly the room seemed to spin, the walls closing in around her. Emma's body felt weightless, as if the air itself had become an unbearable force. Her heart raced, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, but the thing in front of her wouldn't let her. Her vision blurred, and everything went dark. When Emma's vision returned, she found herself in the attic again. The cold air still pressed against her skin, but now it felt like an oppressive weight. Her head ached, and her limbs felt heavy, as though she were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The thing, the keeper of the house, was still with her, standing silently in the shadows. Its glowing eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, and for the first time, Emma noticed something else in the attic. The walls, once old and forgotten, now appeared to be alive, pulsating with a slow, rhythmic movement. The very wood of the floor seemed to groan, as if it were breathing, exhaling in time with her every panicked breath. The house was alive in a way that Emma couldn't understand. It wasn't just a structure of wood and stone. It was a living entity, and she was now part of it. The figure stepped forward, its cold presence creeping closer, and for a moment, Emma felt a deep sense of dread fill her chest. "This is your home now," it whispered, its voice like a snake sliding through the shadows. "No," Emma breathed out, her voice trembling. I won't stay." "You have no choice," the figure replied with a chilling certainty, its form darkening, becoming more solid as if the house itself were feeding it. "You were always meant to return." Emma's pulse quickened. Panic surged through her veins as she backed away, but her legs felt weak, her feet stumbling against the wooden floor. Her chest tightened, and the air felt colder than ever. Her mind was racing, trying desperately to think of a way to escape, but the house seemed to be alive, pulling her in. Every part of it, the walls, the floors, even the dust in the air, felt like it was watching her, waiting. "No, please," she cried out, but her voice barely broke the suffocating silence. The figure stepped closer, its voice now a low, menacing whisper in her ear. "You cannot escape what you are, Emma. You were chosen long ago. This house is your legacy." She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the thundering rhythm of her own fear almost drowning her out. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back even further, but there was no escape. The walls were closing in on her. The door to the attic, the one she had tried to open when she first arrived, was now gone, vanished into thin air. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from something much deeper. The weight of the house's history was pressing down on her, suffocating her with its secrets. It had waited for her, watched her from the shadows, and now that she had returned, there was no leaving. It was too late. "Look at what you've become," the figure murmured. "A keeper of the house, just like your ancestors." Emma's stomach twisted. Ancestors? What was it talking about? She had no memories of being tied to this place. She had come here to escape, to get away from everything her family had left behind. But now, the truth was unraveling, slowly, painfully, in front of her eyes. The attic seemed to grow darker, the shadows thickening and swirling around her. Emma's chest tightened, and the oppressive atmosphere felt like it was choking her, cutting off her ability to think clearly. "You were born to guard this place," the figure continued, its voice becoming distorted and harsh. "Your blood runs through these walls. Your soul is bound to the house, just as your families were before you." Tears welled in Emma's eyes. Her breath was ragged, and she could barely comprehend what was happening. She didn't want to be a part of this place. She didn't want to be trapped in this nightmare. But as the figure reached out to touch her, something inside Emma snapped. It wasn't just fear. It was anger. Anger that this house, this place that had haunted her dreams and nightmares, had been trying to take her for so long. Anger that it was trying to rob her of everything that made her human. With a surge of adrenaline, Emma pushed forward, ignoring the cold that seemed to claw at her skin, and ran towards the attic door, the one that had been locked earlier. This time, as her hand gripped the handle, something shifted. The house seemed to hesitate, the walls groaning as though it were trying to hold her back. But Emma wasn't going to let it. Not this time. With all her strength, she twisted the handle and threw the door open. The darkness beyond the door seemed to reach for her, pulling her in. But she didn't stop. She ran, not caring where she was going, as long as she was away from the entity. She sprinted down the narrow hallway, her footsteps echoing through the abandoned house, but she could feel the walls closing in behind her, hear the faint whispers of the figure as it called her name. "Emma. Emma." Her name echoed, fading into the distance, but Emma didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The house was alive, yes, but so was she, and she wasn't going to be its prisoner. Story 3. It was the week before Christmas when Claire moved into the old house. Nestled on the edge of a small town, the house had an eerie charm, with its tall, crooked windows and ivy creeping up the stone walls. She had always dreamt of living somewhere secluded, somewhere far from the hustle and bustle of city life. So when the opportunity to rent the old house came up, she jumped at the chance, even though the rent was ridiculously cheap. The first few days were peaceful. The house was cozy, and the fireplace crackled with warmth every evening. The winter snow blanketed the world outside, turning the surroundings into a winter wonderland. It was everything Claire had hoped for, a retreat from the chaos of her past. But as the days grew shorter, the atmosphere inside the house began to change. It was on Christmas Eve when the first odd thing happened. Claire had been decorating the tree in the living room, the soft glow of the fairy lights casting long shadows on the walls. As she hung the last ornament, she heard a soft, jingling sound, like the sound of a bell. She paused, heart thumping in her chest. Was it just the wind? Or was it something else? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. It was probably the wind, the way it whistled through the cracks in the walls. But the sound came again, clearer this time, as if it was right behind her. Claire whipped around, her breath caught in her throat. The room was empty. She tried to laugh it off, but something in the pit of her stomach told her this wasn't just her imagination. Something was in the house with her. Trying to push the unsettling feeling away, she finished decorating and turned off the lights. The house grew quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Claire decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would clear her mind. But sleep did not come easily. Around midnight, Claire woke to the sound of the bell again. It wasn't a soft jingle this time. It was louder, almost insistent, ringing in her ears, as though someone was standing in her room, shaking a bell right next to her. She sat up, her heart racing, the covers cold and heavy around her. She strained her ears. Nothing. Just the quiet, oppressive stillness of the night. But then, a voice low and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind, spoke her name. Claire. Her blood ran cold. Her breath hitched in her throat as she strained her eyes in the dark, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, only shadows and silence. The bell rang again, this time right outside her door, and Claire's stomach twisted with dread. She had to get up. She had to check. Slowly, she slipped out of bed and crept toward the door, every step heavier than the last. The air felt thick, as if the house itself were pressing in on her. She opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. The hallway was empty, bathed in moonlight streaming through the narrow windows. But then, from the far end of the hallway, she saw it. A small, old-fashioned bell, hanging from a thin silver thread, swayed in the air, as if someone had just let go of it. The bell jingled again, a soft, hollow sound that echoed through the silence. Claire's eyes widened, her pulse racing. The bell was moving on its own. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. No answer came. The bell was the only sound in the house. Without thinking, Claire stepped forward, drawn to the bell like a magnet. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, a shiver ran down her spine. The room grew colder, the air thick with an unspoken presence. And then, she saw him. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, cloaked in shadow. His features were indistinct, blurred like smoke. But there was no mistaking the glowing eyes that locked onto hers, cold and empty, like two black holes. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, moving toward her with unnatural speed. The bell jingled louder, the sound deafening now. Don't come closer," Claire whispered, her voice trembling with fear. But the figure didn't stop. It kept coming, its steps echoing in the narrow hallway. Claire backed away, her body frozen with terror. She reached for the door, but before she could grab the handle, the figure was right in front of her. The bell jingled once more, and Claire felt something icy cold brush her cheek. The figure's face was now clear, twisted and grotesque, with hollow eyes and a grin that stretched impossibly wide. It reached out, its hand cold and clammy, and Claire screamed, stumbling backward into the dark room. The figure stepped inside the room with her, the bells ringing louder than ever. Claire couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed with fear, her mind racing for a way out. Then, the bell stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, the only sound her labored breathing. Claire's eyes flickered toward the bell, now lying motionless on the floor. The figure had disappeared. But the terror didn't fade. The house had changed. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now felt like they were closing in on her. The air felt thick with something dark and malevolent, and the very house seemed to pulse with life, as if it were alive, breathing, watching. Claire didn't know what had just happened, or who the figure was. But she knew one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't over. It wasn't just a nightmare. The bell jingled again. The bell jingled again, and this time Claire's heart nearly stopped. The sound was so clear, so real, it was impossible to ignore. It echoed through the house, seeming to come from every corner at once. She froze, staring at the empty hallway, her breath shallow and quick. The shadow had vanished, but she could still feel its presence, lingering in the air like smoke. Her mind raced. What was this? Why was it happening? And why had it chosen her? The house creaked around her, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet as if the entire place was alive, waiting. Claire glanced toward the clock on the wall. 2:47 a.m. She had no idea how long she'd been standing there, paralyzed by fear, but she couldn't stay any longer. She had to get out. She had to leave before whatever it was came back. But the house felt different now, foreign, hostile, as if it were rejecting her, pushing her out. She could hear the faint sound of the bell, as though it were following her, teasing her with its quiet jingle. It felt like a warning. Every corner of the house seemed darker, more oppressive than before. She moved toward the stairs, her feet heavy, unwilling to make a sound. She needed to get to her car, needed to leave, but something tugged at her, holding her in place. The bell jingled again, louder this time, almost as though it were right behind her. Claire turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. Just the pale light from the moon shining through the windows, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. The wind howled outside, but inside there was an unsettling stillness, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the attic, a thump, followed by a dragging noise. Claire's heart skipped a beat, her legs trembling as she slowly backed away from the stairs. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by the distinct sound of something, or someone scraping along the floor. Claire didn't wait. She turned and bolted toward the front door, her pulse thundering in her ears. But as she reached for the handle, a cold gust of wind blew from inside the house, slamming the door shut with a deafening bang. She screamed, her voice echoing through the empty house. She tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself was locked, trapping her inside. Desperation clawed at her chest as she fought with the door, her breath coming in short, panic bursts. That's when she heard it again. The bell. Louder now, almost deafening. It rang from upstairs, followed by the dragging sound closer this time. Claire's blood ran cold. She knew she couldn't stay here, not with whatever it was in the house. The bell jingled once more. And then she heard something even more chilling, a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling her name. Claire. Claire. Her stomach twisted with dread. The voice was low and hollow, distorted like it had traveled through the walls themselves. It sent a chill down her spine, the cold feeling sinking deep into her bones. Claire, come closer. The voice echoed through the house, and despite every ounce of her being telling her to run, to escape, Claire found herself moving toward the stairs, her legs moving of their own accord. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the house was pulling her in. The bell rang louder as she climbed the stairs, the sound vibrating in her chest, shaking her to the core. When she reached the top, the house grew colder, the air thick with a presence she couldn't understand. The attic door at the end of the hallway stood ajar, the faintest flicker of light spilling from within. A voice, soft and wheezing, came from the darkness behind the door. Claire, come in. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to leave this place and never look back, but she couldn't. The sound of the bell echoed in her ears, and the voice, no, the thing in the attic, called her name again, more urgently this time. Come to me, Claire." Against her will, Claire stepped forward, drawn to the door. She hesitated only for a moment, the fear gripping her chest like a vice, before she pushed it open. The room inside was dim, lit only by a single, flickering light bulb. The air was thick with dust and the smell was rancid, like old, decaying wood. The bell jingled once more, and Claire's heart dropped. She could see it now, hanging from the ceiling in the far corner, a small silver bell, swaying gently in the air. Its ringing was soft, almost playful, but the unease in the room made it feel sinister, like the bell was waiting for her. Then, from the farthest corner of the room, Claire saw it. A figure dark and hunched over, its body twisted unnaturally. It was sitting in the corner, its eyes glowing in the dim light, two pinpricks of light that locked onto her. Its mouth opened, revealing a row of jagged, yellow teeth, and it smiled, a slow, mocking grin. "You're too late, Claire," the figure rasped, its voice a low, gurgling whisper. "I've been waiting for you." Claire's breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. The house had been calling to her, drawing her in. The bell was its messenger, a way to lure her in. And now it had her. She couldn't escape. The figure stood, its bones creaking as it moved toward her, the bells jingling, growing louder with each step it took. "You belong to me now," it said, its voice growing stronger, more confident. Claire tried to back away, but the room seemed to close in on her. The walls felt like they were moving, pressing in, and the air grew heavier, suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest as the figure stepped closer, the bells ringing, drowning out all other sound. "Claire," it whispered one last time. The bell's sound was the last thing she heard before the darkness consumed her. The darkness swallowed her whole, a suffocating void that pressed against her chest, stealing her breath. Claire's mind spiraled, her heart racing faster than it ever had before. But then, just as quickly as the darkness had claimed her, it all stopped. The air grew still, and the ringing of the bell faded into an eerie silence. For a moment, Claire couldn't move, couldn't think. Everything felt like it had frozen. But then a light flickered ahead, faint at first, before growing stronger, warmer. She could see shadows moving within the light figures, blurry at first but growing clearer with each passing second. The figure from the attic was gone, leaving only the unsettling silence behind. She took a tentative step forward, her feet cold against the floor. And then another. The house, once filled with the oppressive weight of the bell's jingles, now seemed hollow, lifeless. Claire's senses were heightened, every creak of the floor, every shift in the shadows, felt amplified, as if something was watching her. And yet there was no sound, no movement, just that oppressive, empty stillness. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and for a moment she thought she had imagined everything. Maybe it had all been a nightmare, a twisted fantasy born from her fear. But the lingering feeling in her chest told her otherwise. She could still feel it, the coldness of the attic, the sensation of being pulled toward it, the low whispers that had invaded her mind. Something was very wrong. Turning, Claire faced the doorway, the one leading back to the stairs. She could almost see it, the faint outline of the house beyond, the exit so close, yet it felt so far away. She had to get out. She had to leave. But the moment she took a step toward the door, the light flickered and then went out, plunging her back into darkness. Her breath hitched in panic and she turned, expecting to see the twisted figure from before, but there was nothing. The room was empty again, silent, as if mocking her every move. "Claire," came the whisper again, soft and insistent, from the very walls around her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The air thickened, pressing in on her, and the sound of the bell grew louder. So loud it was as if it was right beside her, ringing in her ears. She covered her head with her hands, trying to block out the noise, but it wouldn't stop. The bell kept ringing, louder and louder, until it felt as though her entire world was made of nothing but that sound, nothing but its mocking jingle. Terror flooded her veins. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. She needed to escape. She needed to run, to break free from whatever it was that held her here. But the longer she stood still, the more the shadows seemed to close in, suffocating her in a grip she couldn't break. "Claire," came the whisper again, this time far too close. The voice was not just a voice anymore, it was a presence, something that seemed to wrap around her, fill her with dread. "You can't escape. You're mine now. You always have been." The words hit her like a wave, pushing her down, drowning her in fear. She struggled, but it was like fighting against the wind, against the very air itself. There was no escape. With a scream, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The bell rang once more, its sound deafening as it followed her, growing louder and louder with every step. She reached the door, but just as her fingers brushed the handle, something cold and sharp grabbed her wrist. She gasped, turning to see the figure twisted and contorted, its face now clear in the dim light, its mouth stretched open in a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. But it was too late. The darkness had claimed her. Running won't help, it whispered, its voice cold and malevolent. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, and she yanked her wrist away, but the grip was like iron. The thing's eyes glowed in the dark, bright and hungry. It pulled her toward it, its twisted limbs reaching for her, and Claire stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The bell rang again, louder than ever, filling her mind with its maddening sound. She tried to scream, but no sound came. She tried to move, to escape, but the shadows held her in place. "Claire," the voice whispered again, this time sounding almost tender, "you'll never be free." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the world went silent. The shadows withdrew. The bell's ringing stopped. Claire blinked, her eyes adjusting to the stillness. She was lying on the floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling. For a long moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the cold silence of the house. And then, in the distance, the bell jingled once more. The distant jingle of the bell sent a fresh wave of terror through Claire's body. She lay still on the floor, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound echoing in her ears, even though the bell itself seemed so far away. Was it the same bell? Or had it always been there, a constant presence that she hadn't noticed before? The shadows around her seemed to breathe, growing thicker, suffocating the small sliver of light that still clung to the room. Claire pushed herself up, her arms trembling from both the cold and the lingering fear that was eating away at her. Her breath came out in quick, shallow bursts, and she wiped her eyes, trying to clear the haze that had settled there. Everything around her was different now. The air was thick, heavy, as though it was holding her down, reminding her of the strange presence she'd felt before. Her eyes scanned the room, trying to make sense of it all, but there was nothing. Just an endless, oppressive darkness. The light from earlier, the one that had been so warm and welcoming, was gone. All that was left now was the feeling of eyes watching, waiting. She stood up slowly, unsteady on her feet, her mind a blur of questions, all the answers just out of reach. Was she trapped here? Was this the same house she had entered just hours ago? Nothing made sense anymore. With every step she took, the cold air seemed to get colder, and the shadows followed, stretching and warping unnaturally. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing in and out with her, closing in tighter with every passing second. The bell jangled again, a cruel reminder of the nightmare she was in. Each chime was louder than the last, and Claire's body trembled, reacting instinctively to the sound. She had to get out. She had to find a way out of this madness. Her feet moved, but not with purpose. It felt like she was being pulled, like something was guiding her, something invisible and strong, dragging her deeper into the house. She reached for the door, her hand shaking as it brushed against the cold handle. But before she could turn it, a soft voice filled the room, as if it had been there all along. "You can't leave," it whispered, soft and familiar. Claire froze, her pulse quickening. "You belong here now." The words hit her like a slap, sending a shock of panic through her veins. She spun around, looking desperately for the source, but there was no one, just the oppressive darkness, the weight of it pushing down on her. She opened her mouth to scream, but her voice failed her. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the maddening jingling of the bell, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. Something moved in the shadows. She turned, her eyes wide with fear, and saw a figure hunched, twisted, moving slowly, deliberately toward her. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood, but the faint outline of its form was enough to make her heart race in terror. The bell rang again, louder, closer. The figure took another step, and the room seemed to shift around her. Claire's legs were frozen in place. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in short gasps. She tried to move, to run, but her body wouldn't listen. The figure continued to approach, its footsteps slow and measured, each one echoing in the cold silence. It stopped just inches away from her, the weight of its presence pressing against her, suffocating her. Claire could feel its breath cold and unnatural against her skin. "Claire," it whispered, the voice chilling her to the bone. "You're mine now." Terror gripped her heart. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare at the figure, trapped in its gaze, paralyzed with fear. Every instinct told her to run, but her body refused to obey. The bell jingled once more. Louder now, its sound reverberating through her skull. And then, the figure reached out and touched her arm. The cold that radiated from its touch sent a shockwave through her, paralyzing her even further. Her skin burned as though it was being frozen, the sensation creeping up her arm, down her spine. Her body fought against the icy grip, but it was useless. It was as if the figure was pulling her into its darkness, pulling her deeper into the nightmarish world of the house. "I will never let you go," the figure whispered, its voice like a cold wind, bitter and relentless. The room around her seemed to spin, the walls closing in. Claire could feel her consciousness slipping away, her vision blurring as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole. The bell rang once more, loud and deafening, a sound that would haunt her for as long as she lived. And then, as everything around her collapsed into darkness, Claire felt herself being pulled away, out of the house, out of the cold, away from the figure.